Welcome to CISO Chat session. Today we'll be talking about NDR versus EDR with a CISO. Hello everyone, my name is Victor Monga. I work for VMware based out of Palo Alto, California. I am a leader and volunteer for several communities such as Cloud Security Alliance, Virtually Testing, and ISACA. If you would like to learn more about me, please connect with me over LinkedIn and or Twitter. Thanks so much, Jake, for taking the time and having this chat with us. Why don't we start with a quick introduction of you and we'll jump right into our line of questions.
I work for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. We are the largest water wholesaler in the country. We're also a public sector utility that wholesales water to 26 member agencies, supplying water to 19 million people in the Southern California service area. So we're a rather large organization that you probably aren't all that aware of because you usually deal with your local municipal water provider, such as like a LADWP or somebody like that. So we have a very extensive network to manage, which is definitely been a very interesting line of work for me recently. And before that, just a kind of juxtaposition where I'm at now in critical infrastructure, I was the CISO for the County of Orange, which was a completely different environment in the levels of security and the types of security practices that we looked at. And I say this because on one end, we were now where I'm at, I'm doing working with the security team, and we work together to secure critical infrastructure, industrial control systems type technologies, and all manners of operational technologies. And on the other side, we look at, when I came from Orange County, it was very centric on protecting privacy data and constituent data, and meeting various compliance standards for HIPAA and different systems that law enforcement agencies used. So, but one of the things that you see between those two worlds is that there's some very basic commonalities in security practices, regardless of what you're working in. And before that, I served in the armed forces and worked in cybersecurity in the armed forces and network operations and those kind of things there in general communications. And again, same common threads. And so I always come back to organizations really have to master the basics if they're going to expect to have any kind of maturity in their security programs. And so a lot of what you'll hear me talk about is driving people towards that. Let's just make sure your basics are covered. And you might even hear me make jokes about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as such when I talk about that.
Very impressive background, I must say, and definitely the right person to talk about NDR versus EDR. Before we begin, Jake, I would like to take this opportunity to talk about what is an NDR or an EDR. NDR is a network detection and response tool or a solution. It focuses on network visibility. On the other hand, Endpoint Detection and Response, also known as EDR, focuses on endpoint visibility. So why don't we just jump right into it? And first question is that what kind of visibility that one should look from NDR versus EDR? What would be the subjective perspective when it comes to NDR versus EDR?
I think to answer that question, really you have to consider where most of your traffic is at. And pre-COVID, in a lot of organizations, you might have been more network centric because your users come to work every day and you're concerned with things like SSL packet inspection from computers on outbound internet traffic. And you might be concerned about technologies like secure web gateways inspecting travelers. And so NDR because you also might be talking about an environment where you may even have a traditional SOC or something like that, NDR becomes very attractive. But when you think about how people work today and where they're at, you actually really might want to go more towards the EDR because you have to consider the most common attack vector. And phishing campaigns and user credential theft really amount to the most common types of attack TTPs that an adversary is going to use. And you're going to want to have the capability to capture what an end user is vulnerable to, where the end user works. And so I tend to want to lean more towards the endpoint detection and response world for the first line of defense, or possibly the last line of defense in your security model, because you're going to have that user that's going to click on the phishing link. And then if you don't have something on the endpoint to stop whatever it is it's doing, you're relying on a lot of other things to fall into place. And again, if they're not on your network, if they're not connected to a VPN or some other type of mechanism to your network, You may not know about that until it's a little bit too late and you're dealing with an actual real problem once they do reconnect to your network or data is exfiltrated or whatever the case may be. And so, again, just based on that, I would tend to want to lean more towards an EDR type of platform, which allows organizations to be more mobile, if you will.
And that actually, you brought up an excellent point. Given COVID, I think our workforces are distributed and working from home. At this point, they are not on our network, even though they have VPNs coming up, yes, but at the same time, they're not on our network. The first connection, the packet, is actually be on their own network. So
Mm-hmm.
definitely, I think that makes sense with your answer. So a lot of mature organizations, they have their own SOC team. They have whole SOC dashboards. The religious fight between NDR versus EDR and the integration for response. Which way would you think or consider that for companies or organizations? Which way they should lean towards when it comes to SOC integration for response between NDR versus EDR?
Again, I come back to kind of this idea of, and you'll hear me use some military terms like avenues of approach sometimes, which kind of comes from how we survey the battlefield in the military, or we're taught to. And one of the things that I would look at is you got to think about what the avenue of approach is. Again, if you have an integrated SOC, you probably have a lot of other things going for you, right? You have a cyber threat analyst, and you have some other people that are actually kind of looking at, you have security engineers and on and on and on. You have people that are actually there kind of looking at vulnerabilities, and they're kind of working actively with your organization. You might even have some basic red teaming or threat hunting going on if you have an integrated SOC, because you've had a different level of maturity. But again, when the user's remote, or if the user is going to move around, I'm always going to lean towards that initial response from the initial attack vector. Again, if you look at defense as like a building block kind of thing, if I can block the road, then somebody's got to go someplace else beside the road. Then I can drive them with other terrain there. So if I have endpoint detection and response, and the attacker isn't getting any bang for their buck, because they're not able to exploit end users, and they're going to have to look at another way to get into the network. And I think that at that level, EDR also gives you some interesting indicators of compromise, because it can help you point at other things within your enterprise. So the EDR actually will point to things inside your network, because you'll see you have some sort of software action that's happening on a computer, some sort of malware action or user action on an endpoint when an EDR trips. But you may find that that's because something failed in your secure email gateway, or your web access gateway, right? Or you may be something wrong with your firewall rules, or maybe you need to look at something with how you're doing authoritative DNS. And that will point you to things in your network world that you may want to shore up. Whereas you may not see it conversely the other way if you're focused solely on the network. A lot of NDR providers, and it is a debate between EDR and NDR providers, a lot of NDR services will say, oh, no, we can monitor that. We'll see that traffic. We'll see this something weird thing is happening, provided it's on the network. And so it comes back to that. What do you do with those mobile users? What do you do with those users that are off-prem when they connect? And again, it brings me back to the EDR discussion, because even if you have most of your workforce come on-prem, there's always going to be a body of end users that will work remotely, or there always will be mobile device users or people like that. And so you'll want to look at other products that integrate with those kind of EDR type capabilities to complement each other. And they don't necessarily have to be, NDR doesn't necessarily have to be against EDR. Those are holistic and complementing technologies if you have a budget to afford both in your architecture. But I would say I would lean towards the EDR for that initial detection and response, regardless of my SOC posture, just because that's a more universal attack vector and far more common with what the adversary tends to do nowadays.
That completely makes sense. I mean, again, given COVID, one thing we have learned that devices and our crown jewels are not always going to be inside our own network and all on behind our firewalls. So that actually makes sense. Now, the next question that comes up to be it's going to be around tabletop exercises. So a lot of time, mature organizations, again, they have SOC integrations, they have SOC team, they also do a lot of tabletop exercises for simulation and emulation to understand how and what are their vulnerabilities, what are the open doors. They tend to focus on network. With EDR and for endpoint, what would you recommend if they start with EDR tabletop exercises, and how would they go about it?
Well, so it's interesting because can I answer both? To be politically correct, I'm just kidding, but I kind of do want to say both because you have two different distinct. It depends on what you're flexing on that tabletop exercise, and I would tell you the weak point in most cyber incident response is communication. Engineers know what to do. If you tell an engineer, I need this shut off, they'll do it. I need this contained, they'll do it. People are generally good technically, and I can't say enough positive things about a lot of the IT people that I've worked with over the years. Have been very responsive and very good at taking action when they're directed to do it. So I don't think that's the weak point. Is that what I see? The weak point is, how did I find out in the first place? And you walk it back. That's really where you have to flex your incident response, right? So if I was going to do a tabletop exercise, my first question would be, where'd the report come from? And I'm not going to tell an organization how to do cyber incident response. That's kind of organic to your organization. I would say, and I would recommend, it always include your service desk in cyber incident response because users know that phone number, right? And that's the one that they will call all the time. And they should be integrated as that. Did that come from the service desk? If so, why did it come from the service desk? And did the EDR pop something up on the user and say this application isn't running? Or did the user just call because something that should be running isn't working? And then that kind of starts a rabbit hole, right? Because then they find out that, oh yeah, the EDR blocked that or whatever the case may be. The other reason I would lean towards that option as a point of entry for your communications plan is because the user may not know that detection is there yet, but the analyst may have seen when they do their daily look at, you have a fully integrated SOC and they bring up their, say their EDR console prior to shift change and they go, oh, wow, there's a few detections up here. What am I going to do about those? And that drill should always be, I'm going to put that first line in the system to start the ticketing process because I need to start ruling out that this is or is not a false positive. And as you're walking down that false positive road, you should also be looking at pre-incident response, just so that you're aware if it does become a cyber incident, you can launch those actions that are needed. That's why I say they're not necessarily mutually exclusive from each other. It's where the report comes from that should drive. But you should definitely, when you're doing a tabletop exercise, you want to be centric on what the most likely attack vectors are. So if your exercise is based around a phishing attack, which is most likely, then you're probably going to want to lean it towards EDR versus NDR. If you want to do it based on a phishing attack that maybe your secure email gateway detected, then you may want to lean towards an NDR type response. I would do your incident response based on both so that you could check your, when I tabletop them, I would do them independently. I would do one exercise based on scenario one, end user clicks on X. And then I might do it based on scenario two, end user has clicked on X. We didn't know about it until Y happened. So now let's see how we would walk through our systems and look at what would happen when that system touches our network and what it looks like. Because you can get two different things, right? The NDR may not trip if we do the scenario based on a seeding attack where, you throw the thumb drives around your parking lot and your employees think it's Christmas and they pick up the thumb drive and put it into their system, right? And so we want to look at those kind of things. And plus most or many EDR type products will even address that risk vector. So it does allow you to kind of say, hey, what's going on with this? Maybe that's something that we should be looking for, kind of thing. So I don't mean to be non-committal on that answer, but I think both have value in testing your communications plan when you have an incident, when you want to walk through the drills. But I would definitely do one of each, and I would focus on the EDR. If I had to choose, and I only had a limited amount of time, I would choose EDR because of the most common attack vector is user phishing with trying to steal credentials or something to that end, right?
Right, and that's exactly, back to your point, figure out how are you choosing your tabletop exercise, and based on the budget and time and resources, definitely I think at that point, organization has to make a call. Where is that report and where is that data is coming from? So awesome. So the next part is that a lot of organizations and companies, we have heard that they are using NPM, Network Performance Monitoring Tool, and they feel they can interchange that term with NDR, and they feel that NPM can be served as NDR as well, and they don't need another NDR product. And I don't mean to confuse the terms, but once again, that if a product is solely based on, and the mindset and mission of that product is just performance monitoring of networking, do you think it's wise to consider that as an NDR as well?
Well, I probably would not. I'll state that up front, but because the titles of the products kind of say what the tool does, and I like to have the right tool for the right job. And an NDR is detection response versus performance monitoring. In the title, and what you're looking at for most of that family of products in the industry is a response capability to some sort of or some sort of ability to manage threat. There are some performance monitoring that will state that they have some rudimentary capability, or they may even boast that they have advanced capability to do it. But I would then come back and argue and say, well, you know, and I always say this very tongue in cheek, you can change spark plugs in an old car with an open-ended wrench, but it's a lot easier to do it with a socket wrench, and so, or a socket. So you'd probably want to go with what's ever easier. It doesn't mean you can't get the job done with either or, but you're going to make your life a lot harder if you're using the wrong tool, because you're going to need a lot of compensating processes to account for things that the NPM does that the NDR does that the NPM doesn't. It would be like if you were trying to use an NDR for your performance tweaking and monitoring, conversely, right? It's not what it's, you could. I've used tools that are like that, and I've worked with network teams that use those detection and response tools for network troubleshooting because they're actually good at finding things like asymmetric routes and things like that. But that's not what the tool's intended for. So again, it really kind of comes down to how close your SOC works with your network team and how they share information. But at the end of the day, I would not interchange one for the other. I mean, if all you have is performance monitoring tools and you want to integrate those into your incident response and your detection profile, you can write processes and you can come up with plans to do so. But that may or may not save you more money. You really kind of have to do the cost benefit analysis of how much time it takes people to do that work or to tweak systems and write firewall rules that handle the differences based around what the two different families of products do, versus getting the right tool for the right job in the first place if your intent is to have an NDR centric architecture.
Yeah, and that actually pretty much explains itself, that if you were tend to use, or you were trying to use NPM for performance monitoring, yes, definitely NPM is a great solution, start continuing using it. But if your intention is to use it for detection and response, NPM might not give you the right data even to use that. So once again, I think it boils down to what data you're looking for, your detection and response, and what your product or tool is giving you. That will be the litmus test to decide if NPM can be treated for NDR or not, and most probably not.
A lot of it comes down to is organizations, especially, and again, if you have a SOC and you have people that can do that work, sometimes you get a little bit of a sense of security because you have people that know how to look at things. And let's just say you see something weird, even EDR versus regular endpoint protection software. I've heard, I think it was, I don't want to say this wrong, and I don't have Google in front of me right now, but I think it was McAfee that didn't use antivirus on his own, personally on the computer, because, if you know what you're doing, you probably don't have to worry about that. And we joke around with people, but there's a certain amount of truth to, if you know what you're doing, you're not going to put things on your system that don't belong there, because you're a professional and you know what you're looking for. So again, it kind of comes down to, I wouldn't rely on that, because people retire, people move. Expertise is hard to cultivate. And so you're always trying to balance. Again, that's why I said you have to do that cost benefit analysis on what does it actually cost you to have a human compensate for that? Because you could pick out, if you know what you're looking for, you can pick out an IOC from performance, from log files, things like that. But it would be so much easier if the tool that's designed to integrate things like machine learning, and machines are way better at recognizing patterns than humans, that tool is going to do it probably 9 times out of 10 faster than the human is going to do it. And so your response outcomes are likely going to be better.
Very true. Very, very true. All right. So the last question we have for you is going to be around if an organization has cloud footprint and they are looking for the strategy, they're trying to build a strategy between NDR versus EDR or both, what would your suggestion or what would you advise them at this point?
Just to keep the answer simple at first, is I would say if you're looking at that cloud, you probably already have a distributed workforce, and you're probably going to want to just do an endpoint detection and response software if you have to choose between the two. Because to have a cloud footprint means you've already made significant investment in workloads that are externally facing. And that means you're looking at things like Gartner's Secure Access Service Edge architecture, which means you're probably even looking at software-defined perimeters and different SD-WAN technologies. So really network detection response becomes secondary because ideally you may not even have a data center. But then again, it depends on your maturity and where you're at in that transition. Some companies are cloud native and COVID didn't impact that. That was just another day at the office for them. They turned on their computers and they connected like they always did. And they did things like they have always done them because that's the way their company was structured. But depending on where you're at in that transformation may change that decision-making process. And so if you're really heavily hybrid as you're making the lift to a cloud-based technology, you have to see where most of your traffic is coming in. And so again, I come back to that flowchart logic was, does the bulk of my traffic pass through my on-prem network? Okay, yes or no. If yes, then maybe I want to lean towards network-centric responses still. If the bulk of my work and the traffic is being done in the cloud, say off of users are pulling things down from Google Drive or OneDrive or wherever they're working at, then I'm going to want more EDR type products because there's also another family of technologies that we're leaving out of this conversation because we're talking about NDR versus EDR. But I'm assuming that they've already considered those other family of technologies when they're making that transition to the cloud, because those kind of become your bedrock technologies. And then now you're looking at your security model. And so then I would lean towards the EDR side because you've already considered that you're going to have people working remote and how they're going to get access to corporate resources while they're remote if you're going cloud centric. So that's kind of how I would look. That's why I would look at EDR primarily. But I don't want to leave out the people that are listening that may be in that hybrid phase and they're in that transition, because you don't necessarily want to jump off the cliff onto EDR if you have more pressing concerns and you have a finite budget. You're going to have to compare those costs and you're going to have to see where things go between the users being on-prem and the users being remote. And if you already have technologies that are bringing users back to on-prem, you're not going to just deprecate those overnight because you are going to want to see some ROI on those appliances and services. And you may have agreements in place for infrastructure as a service providers that are kind of enabling you to do that within their data centers. So you might want to take a look at that too, our platform as a service technologies that you may or may not have with other providers before you move 100% cloud, because it's a whole big family of products. And I think most business people, when they're thinking of cloud, they're thinking of SaaS. Most IT people, when we think of cloud, we think of workloads in an infrastructure as a service environment. And so that's why it's a good question. Do you go NDR or EDR? Because if you're an IaaS type environment, that's just an extension of your on-prem data center or a replacement of your data center. So really cloud has to be defined before you can answer that question effectively as well. So I'm not trying to be non-committal on that answer. I'm just saying that if you were a cloud-centric type service, I would lean towards EDR, but depending on where you're at in there, you still kind of have to ask all the same questions.
Yeah, and again, these are religious fights that we discuss is pretty much every day. So
yeah.
Thank you for your insights and really appreciate your time today for chatting with us, and our members definitely would learn a lot from this conversation.
Well, thank you. It's always good to reach out to the community, and hopefully I didn't mess things up too bad with the answers.
No, you didn't.